Long before names or nations, before even memory itself, there came a night when the earth shuddered and froze. Oceans became mirrors, forests turned to glass, and the sky burned cold blue. Yet, in the heart of this endless winter, a few fragile sparks of humankind refused to fade. This is their story of fire against the void, of breath against silence, the night the earth turned to ice. Listen, can you hear it? The whisper that came before the great silence? I am time itself, and I remember everything, every breath, every heartbeat, every moment when warmth gave way to endless cold. Let me tell you of the last summer, when the earth still sang with life, before the ice claimed its throne. In those days, the world wore green like a wedding gown. Rivers danced silver through meadows thick with grass that reached to your waist. Mammoths moved like living mountains across plains, so vast, they seemed to breathe with the sky. Their tusks caught sunlight and threw it back in ivory arcs, and their calls echoed across distances that knew no boundaries. The first Fire's tribe knew this land as their grandmother's heartbeat. They had walked these paths for countless generations, their feet wearing smooth the stones by hidden springs, their hands painting stories on cave walls that would outlast empires yet to be born. They called themselves Kethnari, children of the warm stone, for they had learned to coax fire from flint and tinder, to hold the sun's blessing in their palms even after darkness fell. Ara was their finest hunter, though he moved more like dancer than stalker. His hands could read the language written in broken twigs and pressed earth, could follow the story a deer told with its hoofprints 3 days after it had passed. When he walked, the forest seemed to part for him like water. And when he sat still, the birds forgot he was human and sang their secrets to his listening ears. Beside him lived Sula, the dreamer. Her sleep was filled with visions that came true like morning follows night. She saw where the herds would move before they moved, felt storms gathering, while the sky was still clear blue. The elders said her dreams were gifts from the spirit wind, that she could see tomorrow's footprints in today's sand. But lately, her dreams had grown strange and troubling. On this particular evening, the last truly warm evening any of them would know, the tribe gathered around their fire, as they had for 1,000 evenings before. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks up to dance with the first stars. Children laughed as they chased fireflies, their small hands cupping brief lights that winked like earthbound stars. Mothers sang lullabies in the old tongue, melodies that seemed to weave themselves into the night air like threads of silver. The men passed around skins of fermented berry wine, and their voices grew warm with stories of successful hunts, of rivers crossed, and storms weathered. The reef. Women wove grass into baskets, while their fingers seemed to move of their own accord, muscle memory from generations of making beautiful, useful things. Even the dogs dozed contentedly, their bellies full of scraps, their dreams surely filled with endless rabbits and bones that never diminished. But I remember what they could not see: the first hint of change riding on the north wind, a scent that wasn't quite scent, a temperature that wasn't quite temperature, something shifting in the deep places of the world, like a sleeper turning over in bed before waking. The aurora that night painted the sky in colors that had no names, green and silver and blue so deep it was almost black. Sula felt it first. She woke from her sleep with a gasp that seemed to tear the night in two. In her dream, she had seen great white teeth, closing over the green world, had felt cold breath on her neck that smelled of nothing, not death, not life, but something in between. A vast forgetting was coming. She knew it with a certainty that made her bones ache. When she told Ara of her vision, he listened with the serious attention he gave to tracking signs. He had noticed things too: birds flying south weeks early, animals gathering food with a desperation that spoke of knowing. The herds had been restless lately, snorting and pawing the ground as if the earth itself had grown uncomfortable beneath their feet. But the morning sun rose golden as always, and the day warmed their skin like a kind hand. Children played in the shallows of the stream, splashing and shrieking with delight. Women gathered berries that hung heavy and sweet on the bushes. Men shaped spear points and told jokes that made their companions double over with laughter. Life felt eternal, as it always does to those living it. I watched them love each other in the 1,000 small ways that make a tribe into a family. a grandmother braiding a child's hair with infinite patience, a father teaching his son to chip flint, guiding small hands with his own weathered ones, young lovers stealing glances across the fire, their hearts beating in rhythm with the flames, all of it precious beyond measure, all of it about to change forever. As the day faded into evening, the wind picked up from the north. It carried scents of pine and stone, of distances so vast they made the horizon seem like a pale suggestion. And, underneath it all, something else, a freshness that was almost metallic, almost sharp. The dogs lifted their heads and whined softly. The horses grew skittish, tossing their manes and dancing sideways at shadows. That night, the fire burned lower than usual, as if the wind were stealing its strength. The elders murmured among themselves in voices too low for younger ears, but their worried glances spoke volumes. Children fell asleep sooner, curling close to their mothers, like small animals, sensing a storm still beyond the horizon. And I, watching from my place outside of time, felt something I had not felt in eons, a deep, profound sorrow for what was to come. For I knew this was the end of the warm time, the last night the world would sleep peacefully in summer's arms. Tomorrow would bring the first breath of the great cold, and nothing would ever be the same again. The signs began small, as all great changes do. I watched the first fires people wake to a world that looked the same but felt different, like a familiar song played in a key just slightly off. The sun rose as it always had, but its light seemed thinner somehow, stretched through air that tasted of distances and endings. The birds were the first messengers. Aaron noticed them gathering in numbers that made no sense for the season. Great murmurations of starlings swirling like living smoke across the afternoon sky, and flights of geese honking their ancient songs weeks before their time. They moved with an urgency that spoke of knowledge beyond human understanding, as if they carried news from the edge of the world. Kethy, eldest of the elders, had lived through 80 summers and knew the language of seasons better than anyone. She stood each morning with her face turned north, reading signs in the wind that younger eyes could not see. Her bones ached in new ways, she told the others, deep aches that spoke of pressure changes and atmospheric shifts beyond the reach of human experience. "The sky dreams differently now," she said one evening, her voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "See how the northern lights dance. They flicker like candle flames in wind, but there is no wind in the high places. Something stirs in the far places, something that sleeps when it should wake, and wakes when it should sleep." The aurora had indeed grown strange. Where once they painted the night sky in gentle sweeps of green and gold, now they writhed and twisted like serpents in pain. Colors that had no names in any human tongue bled across the darkness, blues so deep they seemed to swallow, light, silvers that cut the eyes like metal shards. The lights moved with an urgency that made children hide their faces and mothers pull their little ones closer to the fire. Sula's dreams grew more troubling each night. She found herself walking through landscapes that shifted and changed beneath her feet. Forests that became tundra, rivers that froze solid while she watched, animals that looked at her with eyes full of desperate questions she could not answer. In her visions, she heard a word whispered on winds that carried the scent of endings. Ice. It was a word that made her throat close with fear, though she could not say why. The hunters brought back stories that made no sense. Mammoth herds moving in patterns that defied generations of knowledge, following paths that led nowhere. Saber-toothed cats abandoning territories their kind had held for countless seasons. Even the great cave bears, slow to change and slower to fear, were emerging from their dens and heading south, with a purpose that spoke of understanding something beyond the reach of human comprehension. Young Bren returned from a hunting trip with a tale that silenced the evening fire. "I saw the deer standing at the northern ridgeline," he said, his voice still shaking. "Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, just standing, all facing south, like they were listening to something we cannot hear. When I approached, they turned to look at me, all of them at once, and their eyes." He paused, unable to find words. Their eyes held the same terror I see in my own dreams. The word ice began to appear in conversations like an uninvited guest. At first, it was spoken only in whispers, quickly hushed by those who heard it. But as the days passed, and the signs grew stronger, it gained weight and presence. Children were forbidden to speak it aloud, for the elders believed that naming a fear could give it power. But in their dreams, everyone heard it echoing like the sound of breaking stone. I knew what they could not that far to the north. Beyond their ability to travel or imagine, vast sheets of water were crystallizing into monuments of cold. Glaciers were stirring like sleeping giants, creaking and groaning as they began their inexorable march south. The very air was changing, molecule by molecule, becoming something that would bite exposed skin and turn breath to clouds even in what should have been summer's heart. But the first fires people lived in hope, as humans always do. They told themselves that this was merely an unusually harsh season, that the strangeness would pass like a fever breaking. They reinforced their shelters and gathered extra firewood. They smoked more meat than usual and collected herbs and roots with newfound diligence. In their hearts, they knew something profound was changing, but they could not conceive of change on the scale that was coming. The children still played their games, though their laughter carried an edge of uncertainty. The young lovers still met by moonlight, though their whispers often turned to fears they could not name. The mothers still sang lullabies, though the melodies seemed to drift away on winds that came from nowhere and went everywhere. One evening, as the aurora writhed overhead in colors that hurt to watch, old Kethy gathered the tribe around the central fire. Her eyes reflected the flames as she spoke in the ancient words that carried the weight of ceremony. "The world speaks to those who listen," she said. "And it is telling us that the time of plenty is ending. We must listen not with our ears but with our bones, not with our minds but with our blood. Something vast stirs in the north, and we must be ready." The fire popped and hissed as if in agreement, sending sparks up to join the restless lights above. In that moment, every person present felt the weight of change pressing down on them like a physical thing. They did not yet know its name or shape, but they could feel its approach, in their bones, in the rhythm of their hearts, in the way their dreams had begun to taste of snow even while they slept beneath summer stars. And I, watching from my eternal perch, felt the first movement of the great wheel turning. The warm age was ending, not in fire but in a cold, so vast and patient it would reshape continents. The question was not whether the ice would come, it was already coming. The question was whether these fragile, wonderful humans would prove strong enough to survive what I was bringing to their world. It came on a morning when it should not have come at all. The season was still what they called high summer, when the sun should have been painting the world in shades of gold and green. But I remember how the air changed overnight, how the very molecules seemed to slow and crystallize in the pre-dawn darkness. Sula woke first, as dreamers often do when the world shifts beneath them. Her breath came out in small puffs of white vapor, the first time in Naya. Her life she had seen such a thing in summer. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming, still trapped in one of her visions of the cold time. But the bite of the air on her skin was too real, too immediate to be anything but waking truth. She emerged from her sleeping alcove to find the world transformed. Where yesterday there had been dewdrops on spiderwebs, now there were tiny crystals that caught the early light and threw it back in fragments of rainbow. The grass crunched softly under her bare feet, a sound that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Each blade was outlined in white, as if the night had tried to paint the world in frost and had somehow succeeded. The children discovered the frost with delight at first. Little Kira, only 4 summers old, clapped her hands with glee at the way the white coating made everything look like it was covered in tiny jewels. She and her playmates ran through the grass, shrieking with laughter at the strange crunching sound their feet made, bending down to touch the crystalline coating with wondering fingers. "Look," called young Tam, holding up a leaf that had been transformed into delicate filigree of ice. "The spirits painted the trees while we slept." The adults smiled at their innocent joy, but there was unease behind their expressions. This beauty was wrong, out of place, like finding snow in a garden of summer flowers. Ara emerged from his shelter, with the instincts of a hunter, already alert to danger. His experienced eyes read the signs that the children could not. The way certain plants had blackened at their edges, how the small stream that bordered their camp had a skin of ice along its banks, the silence, where there should have been birdsong. The forest felt empty, in a way that made his skin prickle with warnings he could not yet understand. But the sun rose as it always had, and by mid-morning, the frost had melted away like a strange dream. The day warmed, though not to the depths of summer heat they expected. Children played in the sunshine, and their parents worked at the daily tasks of survival. Yet everyone moved with a new awareness, glancing frequently toward the north as if expecting to see something approaching on the horizon. That evening, Kethy called a gathering of the elders. They sat in a circle within a circle, their weathered faces grave in the firelight. Words were spoken in the old tongue, the language reserved for matters that touched the spirit world. They spoke of signs and portents, of stories passed down from the time before memory, of warnings written in the movement of stars and the behavior of animals. My grandmother's grandmother spoke of such things, whispered Gol, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Times when the world turned cold without reason, when ice came to places where it had never been. She called it the sleeping time, when the earth would close its eyes and dream of winter for longer than any human life. The frost returned the next morning, thicker than before. This time it did not fully retreat. When the sun climbed high, patches of white lingered in the shadows, stubborn as old snow. The children's games grew more subdued, as they noticed how their breath made clouds that lingered longer than they should, how their bare feet grew numb if they stood still too long on the crystallized grass. By the third morning, the frost had become rime-thick, white crystals that coated everything like a furry blanket of cold. Trees stood like ghostly sentinels, their branches heavy with ice that tinkled like tiny bells when the wind stirred them. The stream began to sing a new song, a slower, more crystalline melody. As ice crept inward from its banks, the animals began to leave. Not all at once, but with a steady, purposeful exodus that spoke of deeper knowledge than human reasoning could reach. The rabbits disappeared first, their warren entrances empty and cold. Then the squirrels, their cheeks bulging with seeds gathered in panic-driven haste. Even the insects seemed to vanish, leaving a silence that felt like the world holding its breath. Sula's dreams became a torment of white landscapes and howling winds. She saw great herds moving south like rivers of brown and grey, saw forests dying not from fire or flood, but from a cold so intense it seemed to leech the life from anything it touched. In her visions, she walked through a world transformed into crystal and silence, beautiful and deadly as a poisoned jewel. The first Fires people began to understand that this was not merely weather, but something fundamental, a change in the very nature of their world. Mothers dressed their children in extra furs, though it was supposed to be the warmest time of year. Hunters returned with strange tales of empty feeding grounds and abandoned nests. The usual rhythms of life began to falter as uncertainty crept into every decision. On the seventh morning, they woke to find water frozen, solid in the gourds they used for drinking. Ice had formed on the inside of their shelters, tiny crystal gardens growing on the walls overnight. When little Kira tried to touch a particularly beautiful formation, her finger stuck to it, and she cried out in pain and confusion as her parents carefully freed her with warm water. The fire became more than warmth, it became salvation. They fed it constantly now, their woodpile dwindling faster than it ever had. Even in the depths of normal winter, the flames seemed smaller somehow, pressed down by the weight of cold air, struggling to push back the icy fingers that reached toward them from every shadow. And still the frost deepened. What had begun as delicate crystal filigree became thick, white armor coating everything. The world grew quiet in a way that felt final, as if sound itself was being muffled by the advancing cold. Footsteps crunched with finality. Voices carried differently in the dense, cold air. Even laughter seemed smaller, more fragile. From my place outside of time, I watched this first gentle assault of the ice with something approaching tenderness. This was how it always began, not with violence but with beauty, seducing the world into coldness one crystal at a time. The true cold had not yet arrived, but its messenger had come to prepare the way. And I knew that what they saw as strangeness was only the first whisper of a song that would continue for thousands of years. The sun began to forget how to be warm. Oh, it still rose each morning, still painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, but its fire had grown distant, as if someone had moved it farther away while the world slept. I watched the first fires people tilting their faces toward its light with increasing desperation, seeking warmth that seemed to dissipate before it could reach their skin. The days themselves were growing shorter, though it was not yet time for summer's retreat. Ara noticed it first, with the precision of a hunter who measured time by shadow and light. The sun that should have climbed high overhead barely reached the midday point he remembered from just weeks before. Shadows that should have been short and sharp stretched long and dark across the ground, pooling in places where light should have danced. "The sun is dying," whispered young Mira one evening, her small voice barely audible above the constant crackling of their enlarged fire. Her mother hushed her quickly, but the words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel. Because even the children could see what the adults feared to speak aloud, that the great light in the sky was failing them when they needed it most. The quality of light itself had changed. Where once the sun had bathed the world in golden honey, now its rays seemed thin and blue, carrying more shadow than warmth. Colors appeared different under this weakened light. The green of leaves looked gray, the brown of earth looked black, and skin took on a pallor that spoke of more than cold. It was as if the very essence of summer was being drained away, drop by drop. Kethy spent her mornings studying the sky with the intensity of one reading sacred texts. She could see patterns that others missed, cycles within cycles that spoke of forces beyond human control. The aurora had grown almost constant now, writhing across both day and night sky, in displays that were beautiful and terrifying. But it was the sun itself that worried her most, the way it seemed to struggle through the thickening atmosphere, its light scattered and weakened by something invisible, yet undeniably present. "The air itself grows heavy," she told the gathered elders one evening. "Something comes between us and the sunfire, something that eats light and warmth before they can reach us." In the old stories, there were times when the sun would sleep for seasons uncounted, when the world would know only twilight and starlight. I fear those times return. The nights had become endless. What should have been 8 hours of darkness stretched to 12, then 14. The first fires people found themselves burning through their carefully hoarded supply of wood and tallow at an alarming rate, keeping fires burning longer and brighter just to hold back the encroaching dark. Sleep became fitful and cold, filled with dreams of endless winter and dying suns. Sula's visions grew more vivid and more terrifying. She saw the sun as a great eye slowly closing, its lid growing heavier with each passing day. In her dreams, she walked through landscapes where day never truly came, where a grey twilight stretched from horizon to horizon. She saw people wrapped in furs and huddled around fires that seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness surrounding them. The animals that remained grew strange in this half-light world. Nocturnal creatures ventured out during what should have been day, their eyes reflecting the pale sun like tiny mirrors. Diurnal animals remained in their burrows and nests, confused by the early darkness. Even the domestic dogs grew restless and howled at inappropriate hours, as if their ancient wolf blood recognized something their human companions could not yet understand. Ara began to feel something he had never experienced in all his years as a hunter, the sensation of being prey. In the growing darkness, in the strange quality of the failing light, he sensed something vast and patient watching them. Not animal eyes, but something larger and more fundamental. It was the feeling of being observed by the landscape itself, as if the world had developed a consciousness and found them wanting. The cold deepened with each shortened day. What had begun as frost now crept toward becoming something harder and more permanent. Ice formed not just on standing water but began to appear in moving streams, slowing their flow and muffling their voices. The very air began to bite at exposed skin, turning breath to clouds that lingered longer and grew thicker. Children who had laughed at the first frost now shivered in layers of fur and hide. Their games moved closer to the fire, their laughter became more subdued. Parents watched their little ones with new worry, noting how quickly small fingers turned white in the cold, how shallow breathing became in the increasingly frigid air. The carefree joy of childhood was being compressed into smaller and smaller spaces of warmth and light. The tribal fires, which had once been sources of light and gathering, became matters of life and death. The flames were fed constantly now, tended by shifts of people who understood that letting the fire die meant more than discomfort. It meant the very real possibility of never being able to rekindle it. The wood they burned seemed to produce less heat than before, as if the cold was not just around them, but within everything, leaching warmth from the very molecules of fuel and flame. One morning, the sun rose visibly smaller, its disk seeming to shrink, even as they watched. Whether this was illusion created by the thickening atmosphere, or some fundamental change in the celestial order, none could say. But the psychological effect was profound. If the sun itself could diminish, what safety could they find in anything? What foundation could remain solid when the very source of life grew weak? The elders began to speak in whispers of the deep cold, a concept from the oldest stories. From times so ancient, they seemed more myth than memory. According to these tales, there had been epochs when ice-covered lands that had never known winter, when the sun forgot how to warm the earth, when life itself retreated to tiny pockets of stubborn warmth and waited for the world to remember how to live. And I, watching from my eternal vantage point, knew that their fears were not unfounded. The orbital dance of Earth and Sun was shifting into a configuration that would last for millennia. Massive ice sheets were forming in the far north, their white surfaces reflecting away what little solar energy reached them, creating a feedback loop that would drive the world deeper into cold. The age of ice was not coming. It had already begun. The decision came not from the elders or the hunters, but from the children. Little Kira, who had once laughed at the pretty frost, now refused to leave the fire circle even for the briefest moments. When her mother tried to carry her to their sleeping shelter, she clung to the warm stones with fingers that had grown blue at the tips, crying, "No, Mama, the cold will eat me." In that moment, every adult present understood what they had been trying not to see. This was no longer a place where humans could live. The morning of departure dawned grey and bitter. The sun rose as a pale disk barely distinguishable from the clouded sky, its light thin as watered milk. Frost had given way to something harder, a shell of ice that coated everything in armor, that rang like bells when touched. The stream that had watered their people for generations now ran only in the center, its banks locked in crystal that grew thicker each night. They had perhaps 6 hours of what could generously be called daylight, though it was more like twilight stretched thin across the sky. Every breath came out as clouds now, even at midday. The children's coughs had developed a particular sound that mothers recognized with dread, the sharp bark of lungs struggling with air so cold it seemed to cut from the inside. Kethy stood at the center of what had been their home for countless generations. Her weathered hands spread toward the fire that had burned continuously since before her grandmother's time. This flame held the collected warmth of all their ancestors, the accumulated comfort of a people who had learned to hold light in the darkness. Now they would have to carry that fire with them, somehow, into an uncertain world. "We go south," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "South, where the sun still remembers how to be warm, where the ice has not yet learned our names. We carry fire, we carry life, and we carry the memory of green things. The earth sleeps, but it will wake again. We must survive to see that waking." The preparations had been underway for days, though no one had wanted to speak of them as preparations for leaving. Women had sewn extra layers into clothing, creating garments so thick they made movement difficult, but might mean the difference between life and death. Men had crafted special carriers for fire coals, containers lined with moss and clay that could keep embers alive for days of travel. Ara moved through the camp like a ghost, touching familiar objects that would have to be left behind. The grinding stone where his mother had prepared countless meals, the carved post where his father had taught him to tie knots, the small cave where he had first kissed Sula under stars that seemed impossibly distant now. Each thing he touched felt like a goodbye that tore something from his chest. The animals they had managed to keep alive, a few goats, several dogs, and 2 horses, stood huddled together in whatever shelter they could find. Their eyes held the same fear and confusion that filled human faces. Even the dogs, normally eager for any adventure, seemed to understand that this journey was different from any they had known. This was not exploration, but evacuation. Not choice, but desperate necessity. Sula had spent the previous night gathering what remained of the plants that had once grown abundantly around their home. Most were already dead, blackened by frost that had penetrated deeper than any cold should go. But here and there she found seeds still viable, tiny promises of future green wrapped in shells tough enough to survive what was coming. She sewed these into hidden pockets in her clothing, carrying the hope of spring in the midst of endless winter. The children, bundled in so many layers they could barely move, stood close to their parents with eyes that had grown too old too quickly. Little Tam, who had once delighted in the pretty frost, now flinched when the wind touched his face. The smallest ones, like baby Nira, were wrapped completely in furs and carried against their mothers' bodies, shared warmth being the only warmth sufficient to sustain life. As they began to move, each step crunched through ice that had formed overnight. The sound was sharp and final, like breaking bones or shattering dreams. Behind them, the shelters they had called home stood empty and already accumulating the white coating that would eventually bury them completely. The fire pits where they had gathered for generations would soon be filled with snow deeper than a person was tall. They paused at the ridge that marked the edge of their territory, the place where their ancestors had first seen this valley, and decided to make it home. Below them spread the land that had nurtured and protected them for countless generations, now transformed into something alien and hostile. The green meadows had become white expanses. The flowing streams were silver ribbons of ice. The forest was a collection of crystalline skeletons reaching toward a sky that seemed to have forgotten how to nurture anything. Kethy raised her hand for one last blessing, words spoken in the ancient tongue that carried the weight of ceremony and farewell. Land of our mothers, holder of our bones, keeper of our stories, we go now, but we do not forget. Sleep well in the cold time. Dream of warmth. We will return when you wake. Her voice cracked on the final words, and tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. The wind picked up as they began their descent into the unknown, carrying voices that might have been the landscape itself speaking. It whispered of distances vast beyond imagining, of cold that would deepen until it became the only reality. But underneath that whisper, carried on currents too subtle for human ears, was another sound, the patient breathing of the earth as it settled into sleep. Behind them, the last wisp of smoke from their ancestral fire curled up into the grey sky and dissipated. The place that had been home to the first Fires people for time beyond memory was now just another point on a landscape that belonged to ice and wind, and the long, slow patience of geological time. The age of warmth had ended. The age of survival had begun. I watched them walk into the gathering cold, these small, fierce creatures with their precious burdens of fire and hope. They could not know what lay ahead, the thousands of years of ice, the generations that would be born and die, without ever seeing the green world they carried in their memories and dreams. But they walked forward anyway, because that is what humans do. They endure, they adapt, they carry light into darkness and warmth into cold. And in the distance, carried on the same wind that brought the smell of snow and endings, came the sound of drums. Not human drums, but the deep, slow percussion of ice sheets grinding against the earth, of glaciers creaking as they began their inexorable march south. The beat was patient and powerful, the rhythm of a world transforming itself one frozen breath at a time. The first Fires people walked toward their uncertain future, and the drums of the Ice Age began their ancient song behind them. Act I of the great drama was ending, but the story was far from over. In the gathering cold, in the failing light, in the whisper of wind across a world growing stranger by the day, the real test was just beginning. The world had become a prayer written in snow, endless, wordless, terrible in its purity. I watched the first Fires people stumble through landscapes that no longer had names, where white had swallowed every color and silence had devoured every sound, except the endless whisper of wind and the crunch of their desperate footsteps. 3 days into their southward journey, the sky opened like a wound and began to bleed snow. Not the gentle flakes that children catch on their tongues, but driving pellets of ice that stung exposed skin and turned the air itself into an enemy. The wind rose to a howl that seemed to come from the throat of the world itself, and visibility dropped until they could barely see their own hands stretched before their faces. Ara led them with the instincts of a hunter, reading signs in a landscape that had become unreadable. The familiar landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in what had once been a stream, were buried under white anonymity. He moved by feel now, by the slope of the ground beneath the snow, by the way the wind hit his face. Every step was a gamble with death. The children rode bundled on the backs of the two remaining horses, so wrapped in furs that only their eyes showed, wide with fear and wonder at this alien world. Little Kira had stopped crying after the first day, conserving energy with the wisdom that sometimes comes to the very young in times of great danger. She held her breath in small puffs that froze instantly, creating tiny ice crystals around her mouth that her mother brushed away with mittened hands. Behind them, their footprints filled with snow almost as quickly as they made them, as if the world were determined to erase all evidence of their passage. The landscape had become hostile in a way that went beyond weather. It actively resisted their presence, buried their tracks, obscured their path, and whispered constantly of how much easier it would be to simply lie down and let the white silence take them. Sula stumbled more frequently now, her dreamer's feet less sure on the treacherous ground. But her visions had grown clearer, more urgent. In the brief moments when exhaustion allowed her to sleep, she saw caves, deep caverns that held the memory of warmth, protected spaces, where stone walls could hold fire's blessing, and human voices could echo back, instead of being swallowed by the endless sky. On the fourth day, when hypothermia had begun to make the elderly stumble and fall, when even the dogs moved with their tails between their legs and ice forming in their fur, Keithy called for a halt. Her ancient voice barely carried over the wind, but her authority was absolute. They could go no farther without shelter, she declared. They would find refuge, or they would die together. It was young Bren who spotted the dark mouth in the cliff face, partially hidden by drifted snow, but unmistakably the entrance to something deeper. He shouted over the storm, pointing with a mittened hand that shook from cold and excitement. The cave mouth looked like a wound in the white world, dark and promising and terrifying all at once. The entrance was narrow, forcing them to squeeze through one at a time, but beyond it opened into a cavern large enough to hold their entire group. The horses balked at first, their eyes rolling white with fear of the dark enclosed space, but hunger and cold eventually drove them inside, where the temperature, while still bitter, was noticeably warmer than the howling world outside. As they moved deeper into the cave, their voices began to echo back to them, the first time in days they had heard human sound return instead of being swallowed by wind. The children whispered just to hear the whispers come back. A simple magic that felt like contact with something other than the vast indifference of the storm outside. Ara and the other men explored deeper into the cave system, while the women began the sacred task of coaxing fire back to life. The cave paintings they discovered spoke of others who had sheltered here, ancient hands pressed against stone walls, images of animals long vanished, marks that said, "We were here, we lived, we remembered." The cave held human history in its depths, layers of habitation going back to times beyond counting. The fire, when it finally caught and held, seemed like a miracle of light and warmth in the stone womb that had become their world. The flames danced against the cave walls, throwing their shadows into ancient conversation with the painted figures already there. For the first time in days, they could remove the outer layers of their clothing, could feel their fingers and toes begin to thaw, could speak without their words being stolen by wind. But the storm outside continued, a constant presence that filled the cave mouth with whirling white and made the darkness beyond their fire feel infinite. Time began to lose meaning in their stone shelter. Day and night became academic concepts when no light penetrated their refuge except what they created themselves. They measured time instead by the rhythm of feeding the fire, by the cycles of sleeping and waking, by the gradual consumption of their carefully rationed food. Sula appointed herself keeper of the flame during the dark hours, whispering to it as if it were a living thing that needed encouragement to continue burning. She told it stories of the green world they had lost, painted word pictures of summer meadows and flowing streams, of birds singing in trees heavy with leaves. The fire seemed to listen, crackling responsively, throwing sparks up into the darkness like stars trying to find their way back to the sky. The cave transformed them in ways they could not yet understand. Their voices grew softer, more careful, as if they were learning to live inside the belly of the earth itself. Children played quieter games, inventing stories that echoed off stone walls and came back changed. The adults spoke in hushed tones about their situation, but underneath the worry was a strange peace. They were alive. They were together. They were warm. The horses stood in the deeper recesses of the cave, their breathing creating clouds in the cold air, their presence a reminder of the world beyond stone walls. Sometimes in the night, when the wind outside rose to a particularly fierce howl, the animals would shift and snort nervously, and everyone would lie still and listen to the storm trying to find them. Days passed, or what they assumed were days in their timeless sanctuary. The storm outside showed no signs of abating. When brave souls ventured to the cave mouth to check conditions, they were driven back by wind and snow, so fierce it seemed solid, impenetrable. The world beyond their shelter had become theoretical, something they remembered rather than something they could reach. Food grew scarcer. What they had brought was never intended to last this long in one place. The men spoke quietly of venturing out to hunt, but the storm made such expeditions impossible. They began to ration more strictly, giving larger portions to the children and the nursing mothers, measuring each bite against the unknown length of their confinement. Yet in the depths of the cave, by the light of their carefully tended fire, something remarkable happened. Stories began to emerge, tales that had never been told before, memories that surfaced from the depths of collective experience. The cave walls seemed to invite narrative, and the long hours, with nothing to do but survive, created space for the kind of deep sharing that rarely happened in the busy world above. And I, watching from my place outside time, saw how the cave was changing them. They were being refined by confinement, their essential humanity concentrated and purified. The storm outside was reshaping the world, but the humans inside were learning something crucial about endurance, about the warmth that comes not from fire, but from the presence of others who refuse to let the light go out. In the deep silence of the cave, while the storm raged beyond counting days and nights, they heard it first, as vibration through stone footsteps, massive enough to make the earth tremble, breath so deep it seemed to echo in their bones. Life still moved in the white world above, and that life might mean survival. The storm had finally exhausted itself after what felt like a season but might have been only days. Time had become meaningless in their stone sanctuary. When Ara and Bren ventured to the cave mouth, they found a world transformed beyond recognition. Snow lay deeper than a man was tall, sculpted by wind into dunes and valleys that bore no resemblance to the landscape they remembered. The silence was so complete it hurt their ears, broken only by the occasional crack of ice settling, or the distant groan of trees breaking under the weight of accumulated snow. But tracks in the snow told a story of desperate hope. A single mammoth had passed close to their shelter, its massive feet punching through the snow to the frozen ground beneath. The trail was fresh within the last day, perhaps within hours, and from the way the tracks wandered, the uncertain gait revealed in the spacing, this was an animal as lost and desperate as they were. Kethi gathered the hunters what remained of them after the journey, and the storm had taken their toll. Gol's cough had worsened in the cave's dampness, but his hands could still hold a spear. Bren moved with the quick energy of youth, though his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much. Ara bore the weight of leadership like a physical burden, his shoulders curved with the responsibility of keeping everyone alive. One mammoth, Kethi said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy, could feed us through the worst of what's coming. Its hide could provide warmth for the children. Its bones could make tools and shelter. But this hunt will be our last. There will be no more great beasts wandering these white wastes. This is the end of the plenty time, and we must make it count. They prepared with rituals that went back to the beginning of human memory. Spear points were sharpened and blessed. Prayers were whispered to the spirit of the beast they hoped to kill, asking forgiveness for the necessity of taking life to preserve life. The women sang the hunting songs in voices, made hoarse by cave echo and sorrow, melodies that had guided successful hunts for generations beyond counting. The trail led them through a landscape of impossible beauty and terrible hostility. Snow had transformed familiar terrain into something alien. Valleys filled level, hills smoothed into gentle curves, trees buried to their crowns, so that what had once been forest looked like scattered shrubs. Their breath came in clouds that froze and fell tinkling to the ground. Every step was an effort that left them gasping in the thin, bitter air. They found the mammoth in a valley that had once been a meadow, now filled with snow so deep the great beast was trapped, unable to move forward or back. It stood patient as a mountain, its thick fur white with accumulated frost, its trunk moving restlessly as it searched for vegetation that no longer existed. When it saw them, it did not flee. Where could it go? Instead, it faced them with the dignity of a creature that understood its time had come. The hunt that followed was not the fierce chase of better times, when men tested themselves against speed and strength. This was execution born of necessity, as sacred and terrible as any religious ceremony. Ara approached first, speaking to the mammoth in the old tongue, explaining the need, asking permission, promising that every part of its great body would be honored and used. The mammoth's eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to understand. It stood still as Ara placed his hand on its trunk, a moment of connection between two species, facing the same inexorable cold. Then the spears flew, and what followed was both triumph and tragedy, the victory of human ingenuity over impossible odds, and the death of something magnificent that would never walk the earth again. As the great beast fell, its breathing slowing to stillness, Sula began to sing, not the hunting songs of victory, but something new, a lament that seemed to pour from her chest, without conscious thought. Her voice carried across the white wasteland, a sound so pure and sorrowful that even the wind seemed to pause to listen. It was humanity's first dirge, born from the recognition that they had killed, not just an animal, but an entire age of the world. The butchering took all day and into the night, work made sacred by necessity and ceremony. Every cut was deliberate, every portion allocated with the precision of people who knew this might be their last feast for a very long time. The children helped as they could, learning from their elders how to honor what they consumed, how to waste nothing, how to turn death into life, through careful use and grateful memory. The hide, thick and woolly, would provide warmth for months. The meat, more than they could eat fresh, was cut into strips for smoking and preservation. The bones would become tools, needles, tent supports, weapons. The tusks would be carved into implements their grandchildren might use. Even the blood was collected, precious protein that could mean survival in the hungry days ahead. But it was the spirit of the creature that weighed most heavily on them. As they worked by firelight, as the aurora danced overhead in sheets of green and gold, Kethi spoke of the mammoth's place in the world that was ending. These giants had walked the earth when their own grandparents were young. They had been companions to humanity through countless migrations, following the same paths, sharing the same seasons, part of the same vast web of life that was now unraveling thread by thread. "We have killed the last of the great walkers," she said, her voice carrying across the white waste like a prayer. "When the warm time returns, if it returns, the earth will be smaller, quieter. Our children's children will know a world without these magnificent voices. We carry that burden now, along with the gift of their flesh." Sula's song continued through the night, wordless melodies that seemed to rise from some deep place in human consciousness. The mammoth's spirit needed to be sung home, she said, needed to be released with honor and gratitude. Her voice wove through the night air, joined occasionally by others, creating harmonies that had never existed before, but felt ancient as starlight. And I, watching from my eternal vigil, understood that something fundamental had shifted in this moment. Humanity had crossed a threshold. They had become the conscious bearers of memory for creatures that could no longer speak for themselves. In killing the mammoth, they had accepted responsibility for remembering what was lost. In Sula's song, they had found language for grief that was also celebration, sorrow that was also gratitude. The feast that followed was both victory celebration and funeral rite. They ate with reverence, tasting not just meat, but the essence of the old world, the flavor of abundance that would soon be only memory. Children who had known hunger for too long filled their bellies and laughed with joy, while adults ate more slowly, knowing this plenty was temporary, a gift that must sustain them through dark times ahead. As the night deepened and the aurora painted the sky in impossible colors, the bones of the great beast gleamed white in the firelight, already becoming part of the landscape they would leave behind. The mammoth spirit had joined the wind that sang across the ice, and its body had become part of the human story of survival. Survival, I realized as I watched them singing in the cold dark, had become more than mere persistence. It had become a prayer spoken in silence, an act of faith in the face of overwhelming odds. They carried not just fire and food now, but the weight of witness, the responsibility to remember what the world had been, and to carry that memory forward into whatever strange new age was dawning. In the deep heart of the cave, where darkness was absolute, except for the circle of light they created and maintained, the fire became more than warmth. It became memory itself, breathing witness to every story told, every song sung, every prayer whispered into the listening dark. And Sula, keeper of dreams and guardian of flame, began to understand that she was tending more than burning wood. The mammoth feast had sustained them through many days, but even such abundance could not last forever. As the meat dwindled and the rendered fat burned lower in their carefully crafted lamps, the fire became increasingly precious. Every piece of fuel was debated, measured, allocated with the precision of people who understood that warmth meant life and darkness meant death. Sula had taken on the role without being asked, the way water finds its course down a mountainside. While others slept, she sat vigil with the flames, feeding them just enough to keep them alive, but not so much as to waste their dwindling supply of wood. The cave had provided some fuel-dried bones from previous inhabitants, fragments of wood carried in by ancient floods, but not enough for careless burning. In the long night hours, when even the wind outside seemed to sleep, Sula talked to the fire as if it were a living thing. She told it about the green world above, painted word pictures of forests thick with leaves, of meadows where flowers bloomed in riots of color, of streams that laughed as they ran over stones. The flames seemed to listen, dancing higher when she spoke of summer, settling into steady warmth when she described the peaceful abundance they had known. The children gathered around her during these sessions, drawn by something in her voice that was part lullaby, part prayer, part ancient magic. Little Kira, no longer the laughing child who had delighted in the first frost, sat close enough to touch Sula's knee, her eyes reflecting the firelight as she absorbed stories of a world she was already beginning to forget. The older children helped tend the flame, learning the sacred responsibility of keeping light alive in darkness. Fire remembers, Sula would whisper as she fed another precious splinter of wood to the flames. It remembers the sun that warmed the trees, the rain that fed their roots, the seasons that made them grow. When we burn this wood, we're releasing all those summers back into the world. The fire holds time itself. The adults began to bring her their most treasured possessions to burn when fuel grew scarce. Carved figures made by beloved ancestors, tools that had served families for generations, personal items that carried memories too precious to abandon, but too heavy to carry further. Each offering was accepted with ceremony, blessed before being given to the flames, transforming from physical object to warmth and light, and the continuation of life itself. Kethi, ancient, growing more frail with each passing day, spent hours watching Sula tend the fire. The old woman's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with wisdom, seemed to see something in the younger woman that others missed. One night, when the wind outside howled with particular fury, she moved slowly to sit beside Sula at the fire's edge. "You're learning the oldest magic," Kethi whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackle of flames. Before there were healers, or hunters, or leaders, there were fire keepers. They held the light when darkness wanted to claim everything. They remembered warmth when the world forgot how to be warm. You're becoming something your grandmother's grandmother would recognize. Sula felt the weight of tradition settling on her shoulders like a sacred cloak. This wasn't just about keeping their particular fire alive, it was about maintaining humanity's ancient covenant with light itself. Every fire that had ever warmed human hands, every hearth that had brought families together, Every torch that had held back the darkness was somehow present in their small circle of light. The rhythm of fire tending became the rhythm of their lives in the cave. Wake, tend the fire, prepare food, tell stories, sleep, while someone else maintained the vigil. Time became circular rather than linear, measured not by the passage of sun and stars, but by the eternal cycle of flame fed, flame burning, flame dying, flame renewed. They were learning to live by fire time, the ancient human rhythm that had sustained their ancestors through countless dark periods. The cave walls themselves seemed to absorb the firelight and hold it, creating the illusion that the stone was warm even in the deepest cold. The ancient paintings, animals and hands and symbols whose meanings had been lost to time seemed to move in the flickering light, as if the fire was bringing long-dead artists back to life. The children would trace these figures with their fingers, adding their own handprints to the gallery, creating new connections between past and present. But it was during the deepest part of the night, when exhaustion had claimed everyone except the firekeeper, that the true magic happened. In the profound silence broken only by breathing and the whisper of flames, Sula could feel the presence of all the fires that had ever burned. Cave fires of the earliest humans, hearth fires of settled communities, signal fires that carried messages across vast distances. They were all somehow present in their small flame, a continuous chain of light stretching back to the first human who had managed to capture and tame the wildfire. She began to compose songs for the fire, wordless melodies that seemed to help the flames burn steadier and brighter. Her voice, barely above a whisper, wove through the darkness like another kind of warmth. The fire responded to these songs, dancing in rhythm with her breathing, pulsing with the beat of her heart. It became a conversation between human and flame, keeper and kept, memory and hope. As supplies dwindled further, even the fire songs became precious resources to be rationed. Sula learned to sing silently. Moving her lips in patterns the fire seemed to understand without sound. The others watched this strange communion with something approaching reverence. They were witnessing the birth of a new kind of human, adapted to extremes that would have been unimaginable in the warm world above. The fire itself began to change under Sula's care. It burned differently than ordinary flames, steadier, more economical, seemingly able to extract more warmth from less fuel. Whether this was skill, or magic, or simply desperate necessity, no one could say. But the fact remained that their fire consumed less wood than it should have, lasted longer than seemed possible, provided more comfort than the meager fuel could reasonably explain. Children who had nightmares would wake to find Sula singing softly to the flames, and somehow their fears would subside. Adults wrestling with despair would sit beside the fire and feel their hope renewed, though nothing in their circumstances had actually changed. The fire had become a focal point for something larger than warmth. It was the visible symbol of their refusal to surrender to the darkness, pressing in from all sides. And I, observing from my place beyond time, saw how this moment was crystallizing something essential about human nature. In the face of catastrophic change, in conditions that should have broken them completely, they had created meaning from maintenance, hope from habit, community from the shared responsibility of keeping light alive. The fire they tended was humanity itself, the spark of consciousness that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how cold the world becomes. In the deepest part of the night, when Sula's songs were the only sound in the stone womb that sheltered them, the flames seemed to whisper back, not words, but something deeper than language, older than speech. They spoke of endurance and memory, of the long patience required to survive the impossible, of the sacred duty to carry light forward into whatever darkness lay ahead. The fire remembered, and through Sula's careful tending, it taught them all to remember too. Not just the green world they had lost, but their own capacity to create warmth in the coldest places, light in the deepest darkness, hope in the face of despair. They came out of the white waste like memories given form human shapes so pale and thin they seemed translucent, moving across the snow with the terrible grace of those who had learned to become part of the cold itself. I watched the first fires people emerge from their cave shelter to discover they were not alone in this transformed world, and that survival sometimes demanded choices that could break the heart or preserve the soul. The storm that had driven them to shelter had been the last of the great 8 blizzards, though they would not know this for weeks to come. When Ara and Bren ventured out to check conditions, they found a world locked in crystalline stillness. The snow had hardened to a surface that could bear a person's weight, creating an endless plain of white that reflected the pale sun with painful brightness. The silence was so complete it seemed solid, broken only by the distant crack of ice settling or the whisper of wind-carved snow crystals blowing across the frozen surface. It was Bren who spotted them first, dark specks moving against the white expanse, too large to be animals, too purposeful in their movement to be anything but human. He called out with excitement that turned quickly to unease as the shapes drew closer and resolved into people unlike any they had ever seen. The strangers were a family, or what remained of one. A man, a woman, and 3 children, all of them so thin that their clothing hung like burial shrouds. Their skin had taken on a pallor that seemed to go deeper than cold, as if the white world had begun to claim them from the inside out. Their eyes were enormous in their gaunt faces, dark pools that held the kind of desperate hope that comes just before despair claims everything. They approached with the careful, measured steps of people who had learned that sudden movements could mean the difference between life and death. The man raised his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent, though the gesture was barely visible through the wrappings he wore. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if the cold had frozen his words at their source. "Fire," he said in a dialect that was almost but not quite recognizable. "Please." "Children." So cold. Kethy emerged from the cave to assess these unexpected visitors, her ancient eyes reading signs in their appearance that others missed. These people had been traveling far longer than the first Fire's tribe, had been living in the white world for seasons rather than days. They carried no supplies that she could see, no weapons except what looked like sharpened bones tied to sticks. They had been reduced to the absolute essentials of survival, and even those were failing them. The strangers' children stood behind their parents with the terrible stillness of those who had learned that movement required energy they could not spare. The youngest, a girl who might have been 4 or 5 summers old, swayed slightly on her feet, her eyes unfocused, with the kind of exhaustion that sleep could not cure. Her lips had taken on a blue tinge that spoke of hypothermia setting in despite her layers of ragged furs. Sula felt her heart contract at the sight. These people were them, perhaps, a few weeks further along the path of degradation. They were what the first Fire's tribe might become if the cold continued, if food ran out, if the careful rationing and shared warmth proved insufficient. Looking at them was like gazing into a possible future none of them wanted to contemplate. The debate that followed was conducted in whispers around their own fire, while the strangers waited in the bitter air outside. Food was already scarce, carefully rationed to last as long as possible. Adding 5 more mouths would mean everyone eating less, would shorten their own survival time by precious days or weeks. The warmth of the cave was finite, the fuel for their fire measured and allocated. Sharing could mean condemning their own children to the same slow starvation they saw in the strangers' faces. "We have barely enough for ourselves," Gol whispered, his voice hoarse with the cough that had worsened during their cave stay. "Those children, they're already more than half dead. Saving them might kill our own little ones." Bren, still young enough to believe in simple choices, argued for turning them away. "We didn't ask them to come here. We're not responsible for their survival. Our first duty is to our own people, our own children." But Kethy sat silent through the debate, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the fire that had become the center of their world. When the arguments had run their course and the silence stretched taut with unspoken decisions, she finally spoke. "I have lived 80 summers," she said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated years and wisdom. "I have seen tribes rise and fall, have watched good people make terrible choices, and terrible people make good ones. I know the mathematics of survival, the brutal arithmetic of who lives and who dies when resources are scarce." The cave fell silent, except for the crackle of flames and the distant whisper of wind outside. "But I also know this," Kethy continued. "When we start choosing which children deserve warmth and which do not, when we begin deciding that some humans are worth saving and others are not, we become something other than human. We become animals fighting over scraps. We lose the very thing that makes survival worthwhile." Sula felt the truth of those words settle in her chest like a physical weight. She thought of little Kira, of baby Nira, of all the children whose laughter had once filled their world with joy. Could she look at other children suffering in the cold and choose to let them die so that her own people might live a few days longer? The decision, when it came, was not really a decision at all. It was a recognition of what they had always known about themselves, that some things were more important than mere survival, that preserving their humanity was worth the risk of losing their lives. They opened their cave to the strangers, shared their fire and their dwindling food, made room in their shelter for 5 more souls hanging on the thin thread between existence and ending. The strangers wept when they felt the warmth of the fire on their faces, when they tasted the rich mammoth broth that Sula ladled carefully into their mouths. The youngest child, who had been silent and still as a carved figure, suddenly began to cry, the first sound of life any of them had made. Her tears were a celebration and a breaking point, the return of enough strength to feel emotions beyond mere endurance. That night, as they all huddled together in the warmth that was now divided among 15 people instead of 10, the strangers told their story in broken phrases and haunted silences. They had come from the far north, from lands where the ice had advanced so far and so fast that entire tribes had been swallowed without warning. They had been walking south for more days than they could count, following rumors of warmth, following hope that grew thinner with each step. Their names, when they could remember to speak them, sounded like wind through ice caves. Yarek and Naya, the parents. Senna, Torv, and little Mira, the children who had learned to measure life in heartbeats and breaths taken one at a time. They brought news of the world beyond, of ice sheets stretching to horizons, of animals frozen solid while still standing, of other tribes that had simply vanished into the white waste as if they had never existed. But they also brought something else, gratitude so profound it seemed to warm the cave itself. In choosing to share, the First Fire's people had not just saved lives, they had preserved something essential about what it meant to be human. They had chosen connection over isolation, hope over despair, love over fear. The fire burned differently that night, fed by the combined breath and body heat of 15 people who had found each other in the vast loneliness of the frozen world. Stories were shared, songs were sung in multiple dialects that somehow harmonized into something new and beautiful. Children who had almost forgotten how to play began tentative games, their laughter mixing with the crackle of flames and the whisper of wind outside. And I, watching from my eternal vantage point, understood that this was how humanity would survive the long cold, not through hoarding and isolation, but through the radical act of sharing warmth with strangers. In opening their shelter to those who needed it most, they had discovered the mathematics of the heart, which multiplies rather than divides, which creates abundance from scarcity through the simple act of caring for one another. The cold outside pressed against their cave with the patience of geological time, but inside, warmed by fire and fellowship, they had created something the ice could not touch: the fierce, stubborn love that refuses to let the light go out, no matter how dark the world becomes. In the deepest cold, when the world had become a crystalline tomb, and every breath was a victory against the forces trying to claim them, love revealed itself, not in gentle gestures, but in the willingness to trade one's own life for the continued beating of another's heart. I watched Ara discover the true weight of devotion, and in his sacrifice, I saw humanity learn its most essential lesson. The unified tribe for that was what they had become. No longer strangers, but family forged by shared necessity, had lived through the worst cold any of them had ever known. The temperature outside had dropped so far that the air itself seemed to crystallize, turning breath to ice before it could leave their mouths, freezing tears before they could fall. Even inside the cave, wrapped in every fur and hide they possessed, huddled around their carefully tended fire, the cold pressed in like a living thing, seeking to claim them. It was little Mira, not Kira of their own tribe, but the youngest stranger who had arrived more dead than alive, who first showed signs of the deep cold sickness. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, Her skin took on a waxy pallor that no amount of shared warmth could cure. She had survived her family's ordeal through the white waste, only to be claimed by a cold so profound it seemed to reach into the very essence of life itself. Sula tried everything: heated stones placed against the child's body, broth poured drop by drop between lips that barely moved, songs sung to call her spirit back from whatever distant place it was wandering. But the cold had found its way inside the little girl, and no external warmth could reach the frozen places in her core. The storm that came on their 14th day in the cave was different from the others. This was not the howling violence of wind and snow they had weathered before, but something deeper and more patient, a vast, slow pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from the air. The wind outside dropped to an eerie whisper, but the cold intensified until ice began forming on the cave walls despite their fire, until the water they kept heated began to develop a skin of crystal even while sitting close to the flames. Ara watched little Mira's struggle with the eyes of a man who had spent his life reading the signs of life and death in the wild. He saw what the others were trying not to see, that the child was losing her battle with the cold, that her small body was shutting down system by system as hypothermia claimed her from within. Her parents held her between them, sharing what warmth they could, but their own resources were so depleted that they had little heat to give. When the crisis came, it came suddenly. Mira's breathing stopped, her body going rigid in a way that spoke of the final stage of deep cold poisoning. Her mother's cry of despair echoed off the cave walls, a sound so raw and primal it seemed to tear something fundamental in the fabric of human endurance. In that moment, every parent present felt the terror that their own children might be next, that the cold was taking them one by one in order of weakness. Without conscious thought, without debate or hesitation, Ara moved. He stripped away his outer furs, the carefully layered insulation that had kept him alive through the worst cold any human had ever endured, and wrapped them around the dying child. His own heat, stored in the wolf pelts and mammoth hide that had become his second skin, transferred to her small body like a blood transfusion of warmth. But it was not enough. The child needed more than borrowed furs. She needed the direct warmth of a living body, the shared heat that only came from skin, touching skin. Ara pressed her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her tiny form, giving her not just his warmth but his very life force. He began to sing not the hunting songs or the fire songs, but something new, something that seemed to pour directly from his heart to hers. The others watched in growing alarm as Ara's sacrifice revealed its true cost. Without his protective layers, in direct contact with air so cold it burned exposed skin, his own body began to lose heat faster than it could generate it. His lips took on the blue tinge they had seen in the dying child. His breathing became the shallow, rapid pattern of someone sliding into hypothermia. Sula tried to wrap additional furs around both Ara and the child, but he pushed them away with movements that were already becoming sluggish. "She needs all of it," he whispered, his voice growing thick with cold. "Children first. Always children first." Through the long night that followed, Ara held little Mira against his chest while his own life slowly ebbed away. His body heat, concentrated and focused, gradually warmed her core temperature, enough for her breathing to resume, for her heart to find its rhythm again, for the color to return to her waxy skin. But with each degree of warmth he gave her, he lost that same heat from his own system. Kethi sat beside them through the vigil, her ancient hands touching Ara's forehead, reading the signs of his decline with the knowledge of one who had seen many deaths. She knew what the others were beginning to understand, that Ara was trading his life for the child's, that his sacrifice would save her but kill him. She whispered the old prayers, the words spoken over those who were crossing from the world of the living to whatever lay beyond. As dawn approached, not that they could see it in their cave shelter, but their bodies somehow knew the rhythm. Even in perpetual darkness, little Mira's breathing strengthened and her color improved. She was going to live. But Ara's breathing had become so shallow, it was barely perceptible, his skin so cold that touching him was like touching stone. In the growing light, from their carefully tended fire, Sula began to sing. Not the lullabies or work songs they all knew, but something entirely new, a melody that seemed to rise from the deepest places of human sorrow and love. Her voice, clear and strong despite the grief that threatened to break her heart, filled the cave with a sound that was both mourning and celebration, farewell and gratitude. The song that poured from Sula was humanity's first true elegy, born from the recognition that love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice, that the greatest act of devotion was the willingness to die so that others might live. Her melody wove through the cave like visible warmth, touching every person present, connecting them in a web of shared grief and understanding. Others began to join her song, tentative harmonies that built into a chorus of voices, united in loss and love. They sang for Ara, but also for every sacrifice made in love, every life given willingly for the preservation of others. The children, understanding something beyond their years, added their small voices to the funeral song, creating a sound that seemed to bridge the gap between earth and whatever lay beyond. Ara's eyes opened one last time, focusing on the child who now breathed easily in his arms. A smile crossed his features, not the bitter grimace of pain, but the peaceful expression of someone who had seen his purpose fulfilled. He whispered something too soft for any but Sula to hear. She will remember warmth. When his breathing finally stopped, when the great hunter's heart beat its last rhythm, the song continued. Sula's voice rose above the others, keening and beautiful, a sound that seemed to carry his spirit up through the stone roof of the cave and into whatever sky waited beyond the endless winter. And I, witness to this moment that would echo through all of human history, understood that something fundamental had changed in the nature of the species I was watching. Grief had become language, sorrow had become art, and love had revealed itself as the force that could transform death into meaning. In Ara's sacrifice and Sula's song, humanity had discovered that survival was not just about preserving life, but about preserving the reasons that made life worth living. The fire burned lower as Act 2 drew to its close, but it still burned. The cold pressed closer, but it had not conquered. In the warm curve of Sula's arms, little Mira slept the peaceful sleep of the saved, her breathing steady and strong. The burial of warmth had revealed warmth's true nature, not something that could be hoarded or protected, but something that multiplied when shared, that grew stronger when given away. In the fading light, in the whisper of wind outside their shelter, in the rhythm of hearts still beating against all odds, the long night began its slow retreat. Act 2 ended not in victory but in the quiet persistence of love, the stubborn refusal to let the light go out, the understanding that sometimes the greatest triumph is simply continuing to exist in the face of impossible cold. The drums of the Ice Age continued their patient rhythm, but they were joined now by another sound, the beating of human hearts that had learned to love fiercely enough to survive anything the world could offer, and to sing their survival into something approaching beauty. I have watched the world sleep and wake through countless cycles, but never had I witnessed an awakening quite like this. Not just the return of warmth to a frozen land, but the stirring of something deeper. The first movements of a species learning to carry memory like a sacred flame. The ice had held dominion for longer than human generations could count, but even the deepest cold must eventually yield to the patient persistence of the sun. The change began so subtly that at first, no one dared trust it. After winters beyond counting, after cold so profound it had redefined what it meant to be alive, the air in their cave shelter began to lose its knife-edge sharpness. Water that had frozen solid in containers near their fire stayed liquid for longer periods. The ice that had formed nightly on the cave walls grew thinner, sometimes failing to appear at all. Sula, now the undisputed keeper of flame and memory, felt the shift first in her bones. The deep ache that had settled into her joints during the worst of the war's cold began to ease. Not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of seasons returning to their ancient rhythm. She was an old woman now, though she had lived only 35 summers. The ice years had aged them all in ways that went beyond mere time, etching survival into every line of their faces, every careful movement of their bodies. The children who had been born in the cave during the long, cold little ones who had never seen green things or felt rain on their skin began to exhibit a restlessness that puzzled their elders. They seemed to sense something stirring in the world beyond their stone shelter. some vibration in the earth that called to blood older than memory. Baby Nera, who had taken her first steps on Cavestone, would stand at the entrance for long periods, staring out at the white expanse, as if waiting for something she had never seen but somehow expected. When Bren finally ventured outside for longer than the brief foraging expeditions that had sustained them, he returned with news that seemed too wonderful to believe. The eternal snow that had covered the world in unmarked white was showing patches of darkness, not the grey of ash or the black of char, but the rich brown of earth remembering how to breathe. In sheltered spots where the sun managed to linger, tiny pools of meltwater had appeared, their surfaces dark mirrors reflecting a sky that seemed somehow bluer than it had been. The sound came next, a sound so foreign after years of silence that at first they thought it was their imagination. The distant whisper of running water, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably the voice of streams beginning to move again. Ice that had locked the world in crystalline stillness was surrendering to the patient warmth of lengthening days, releasing water that had been frozen for longer than anyone could remember. Kethy, ancient beyond her years, but still sharp with the wisdom of accumulated seasons, spoke what they were all thinking but feared to voice. The earth stirs. The great sleep ends. Her words carried the weight of prophecy, but also the caution of one who had learned not to trust hope too quickly or completely. The exodus from the cave was not a dramatic departure but a gradual emergence, like flowers opening to uncertain sunlight. First came brief expeditions to gather the new water that pooled in rocky hollows. Then longer journeys to explore the changing landscape. Finally, overnight trips to test whether the world beyond their stone shelter could support human life again. What they found was a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The familiar contours of their homeland had been carved and reshaped by the passage of ice. Where once there had been valleys, now there were lakes filled with dark water that reflected the sky like polished obsidian. Hills had been worn smooth or carved into new configurations. The forest they remembered was gone, but in its place were scattered groves of trees that had somehow survived in protected pockets, their bark scarred but their roots still strong. Most miraculous of all was the life that began to appear. First came the moss-tiny patches of green that seemed to glow with their own inner light after so many years of colorless world. Then small insects, emerging from whatever hidden places had sheltered them through the endless winter. Birds returned in small flocks, their songs tentative at first, as if they too were relearning how to celebrate the warmth. The children who had known only cave echo and fire crackle heard their first bird song with expressions of wonder that brought tears to adult eyes. Little Mira, the child whose life Ara had purchased with his own, stood transfixed as a sparrow landed near their temporary camp, its small body trembling with life and music. She reached out toward it with the careful reverence of someone encountering magic for the first time. "What is it?" she whispered to Sula, her voice filled with awe. "It's the world remembering how to sing," Sula replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "It's the sound of tomorrow beginning." The gradual warming brought challenges along with its gifts. Bodies accustomed to desperate conservation of energy had to learn new rhythms. Eyes that had adapted to cave darkness struggled with the increasing brightness of longer days. Feet that had known only stone floors and packed snow had to remember how to navigate soft earth and growing vegetation. But perhaps the greatest challenge was emotional learning to trust that this warmth would last, that the terrible cold would not return without warning to reclaim everything they had gained. The cave-born children adapted quickly, their young minds accepting each new wonder as simply part of the world's expanding possibilities. But the adults moved carefully, always ready to retreat to shelter, always mindful of how quickly abundance could turn to scarcity. Sula established new rituals for this changing world. Each morning, she would add new fuel to their fire and speak aloud the changes they had witnessed the previous day, a verbal inventory of returning life that served as both celebration and historical record. The moss has spread to cover the large boulder near the stream, she might say, or 3 new bird types have appeared in the grove where we gather kindling. These daily recitations became a form of prayer, an acknowledgement that they were witnessing something sacred, the resurrection of a world that had seemed permanently dead. The children learned to contribute their own observations, adding their small voices to the growing catalogue of recovery and renewal. As the days grew noticeably longer and the warmth more reliable, they began to venture farther from their cave sanctuary. They discovered other survivors, scattered groups of humans, who had somehow endured the long cold in their own shelters and refuges. These meetings were tentative at first, marked by the wariness of people who had learned that resources were precious and strangers could be either salvation or threat. But the returning abundance made generosity possible. Again, streams provided water without the need for melting ice. Edible plants began to appear in protected areas. Small animals, emerging from their own survival strategies, could be hunted without the desperation that had marked their pursuit of the last mammoth. The arithmetic of survival grew less brutal as the world remembered how to provide. The network of survivors began to weave itself back together through shared stories and mutual aid. Each group had its own tales of endurance, its own losses and miraculous preservations. They had developed different techniques for maintaining fire, different strategies for conserving body heat, different ways of marking time, in a world where seasons had lost their meaning. From these exchanges, a new kind of knowledge emerged, not just the practical wisdom of survival, but the deeper understanding that they had all been part of something larger than individual or tribal endurance. They had been witnesses to the world's death and resurrection, keepers of memory through a time when memory was the only thing that connected the present to the possibility of a future. As spring for that was what they were learning to call this season of returning life, progressed into something approaching summer, the transformation accelerated. Grass appeared in spreading patches of green that seemed impossible after so much white and grey. Flowers bloomed with colours so vivid they hurt eyes accustomed to the muted palette of survival. Trees that had seemed dead put forth new leaves, their branches reaching toward a sun that seemed to remember how to nurture rather than merely illuminate. And I, watching from my eternal vantage point, felt something I had not experienced in millennia: surprise at the resilience of these small, remarkable creatures. They had not merely survived the great cold, they had been transformed by it, refined into something harder and more precious than what they had been before. In learning to carry memory through the darkest time, they had become the first true humans, not just clever animals, but conscious participants in the vast story of existence itself. The thawing earth was teaching them their first lesson in the deep cycles of time, that what seemed permanent was temporary, that what appeared dead might only be sleeping, that the capacity to remember and hope could carry life through any darkness. In the growing warmth, in the returning green, in the tentative songs of birds learning to celebrate again, they glimpsed their own future, a species that would carry light through any darkness, memory through any forgetting, hope through any despair. The long night was ending, and with it, the childhood of humanity. What emerged into the warming world was something new, a species that had looked into the face of extinction and learned to sing. In the growing warmth of the world's reawakening, when green things pushed through thawed earth and the sun remembered how to linger in the sky, Sula felt the weight of years settling on her shoulders like a well-worn cloak. She had become the bridge between the time before ice and the time after warmth, the keeper of stories that would determine whether the hard-won lessons of survival would live or die with her generation. The young ones gathered around her in the evenings now, drawn not just by the warmth of the fire, but by something deeper, the recognition that she held knowledge that could not be found anywhere else. These children, born in caves, or in the first tentative camps of the warming time, had never known the green abundance their grandparents remembered. To them, the world of plenty was myth, and the world of ice was history they could barely comprehend. Sula watched them, with eyes that had seen the arc of catastrophe and recovery, noting how they moved with the easy confidence of those who had never known real scarcity. Little Mira, now grown to 10 summers and quick with laughter, could not truly understand that the berries she gathered so carelessly had once been precious beyond imagining. Young Tam built fires with casual abundance, having never learned to count each piece of kindling as a choice between warmth and future cold. It was a blessing, this innocence, but also a danger. The memory of the great cold was fading as surely as snow melts in spring sunshine, and with it the hard-won wisdom of endurance. Sula felt the urgency of time passing, the knowledge that what was not deliberately preserved would be lost forever. "Gather close," she would say as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, colors that had seemed impossible during the gray years of endless winter. "Let me tell you how fire learned to dance." But these were not the feel-good, simple entertainment stories of easier times. These were memory teachings, carefully crafted to carry essential knowledge wrapped in narrative that young minds could hold and cherish. She spoke of fire as a living thing that needed care and respect, weaving practical knowledge into tales that made the children gasp with wonder and lean forward with attention. In the before time, she would begin, her voice carrying the cadence of ceremony. Fire lived wild in the deep places of the earth, sleeping in certain stones, dreaming in the hearts of special trees. Our ancestors learned to wake it, to call it forth, to make it our companion. But fire remembers its wild nature. Treat it carelessly, and it will abandon you. Honor it properly, and it will warm your children's children for generations beyond counting. The children absorbed these teachings with the intensity of those who sensed, even without understanding, that they were receiving something sacred. They learned not just how to build and maintain fires, but why firekeeping was a spiritual as well as practical responsibility. They practiced the movements Sula taught them, the careful arrangement of kindling, the patient nurturing of small flames, the respectful offering of larger fuel, as the fire grew strong enough to accept it. But the lessons went beyond firecraft. Sula taught them to read the subtle signs of changing weather, knowledge that had meant the difference between life and death during the uncertain climate of the recovery years. She showed them how to identify edible plants, not just in their current abundance but by the characteristics that would remain recognizable even under stress. She taught them to observe animal behavior as a source of information about environmental changes too subtle for human senses to detect directly. Most importantly, she taught them the discipline of gratitude, the recognition that abundance was not humanity's natural state, that the plenty they were experiencing was a gift that could be withdrawn as surely as it had been given. Never take more than you need became a central teaching. Always leave something for tomorrow. Always share with those who have less. Always remember that the earth itself is alive and listening to how we treat its gifts. The other adults watched these evening sessions with expressions that mixed relief with melancholy. They understood what Sula was doing, creating living repositories of collective memory, ensuring that the lessons of the Great Cold would survive even if those who had lived through it did not. But they also saw their own mortality reflected in her urgency, recognized that the passage of knowledge from one generation to the next marked the beginning of their own transition from active participants to remembered ancestors. Kethi, now so ancient that her exact age had become a matter of legend rather than counting, often sat beside Sula during these sessions. Her presence lent additional authority to the teachings, her occasional nods and murmured confirmations validating the accuracy of the stories being told. Sometimes she would add details that only someone of her vast experience could provide. Small corrections or elaborations that refined the lessons with the precision of lived truth. "Tell them about the listening," Kethi said one evening when Sula had finished explaining how to judge the quality of different types of wood for burning. "Tell them how the fire speaks back to those who know how to hear." Sula nodded and turned back to her audience of bright faces, reflecting the dancing flames. "Fire is not silent," she said. "It tells you stories if you learn its language. A fire that crackles and pops speaks of wet wood or green wood, fuel that is not ready to burn cleanly. A fire that hisses warns of hidden moisture, or sap. A fire that burns too quickly without giving proper heat tells you the wood is too dry, too small, not dense enough to sustain you through a long night." She paused, listening to their own fire as if demonstrating the lesson. But a fire that burns steadily, with only occasional soft sounds, a fire that consumes its fuel completely and leaves clean ash, that fire is content. That fire will be your partner through the darkest hours, your companion when all other lights fail. The children listened with the focused attention of students who sensed they were learning something essential, though they might not understand its full significance until years later. Some of them began to mimic Sula's careful listening posture, tilting their heads toward the flames as if trying to discern meaning in the soft sounds of combustion. As the season progressed and the world continued its remarkable recovery, Sula expanded her teachings to include the arts of memory itself. She taught the children how to weave stories together so that forgetting one detail would not cause the loss of entire bodies of knowledge. She showed them techniques for embedding practical information in memorable narratives, for creating mental connections that would allow important facts to survive, even when the specific circumstances that made them relevant had changed. Memory is like fire, she explained. It needs to be fed regularly, or it will die. But unlike fire, memory grows stronger when it is shared. The story I tell you becomes different when you tell it to someone else, not wrong, but adapted to new listeners, new times, new needs. This is how knowledge lives beyond the people who first discovered it. The most challenging lessons were the ones that dealt with hard choices, the times when survival required decisions that went against natural human kindness. Sula struggled with how to teach children who had never known real scarcity about the brutal mathematics of resource allocation, the terrible moments when helping others might mean dooming oneself. She found ways to discuss these realities without destroying the children's faith in human goodness. She spoke of difficult decisions as tests of wisdom rather than failures of compassion, times when the heart and mind had to work together to find solutions that preserved both life and humanity. She told them about Ara's sacrifice not as tragedy, but as the ultimate expression of love, the choice that showed how death could sometimes serve life. "Tell the sky who we are," she would say as the evening sessions concluded and the children prepared for sleep, "so it won't forget us again." This became their ritual closing, a reminder that their individual lives were part of a larger story, that their survival carried responsibilities to both past and future. The children would look up at the star-filled sky clearer now than it had been during the dust and ice years, and silently make their own promises to remember, to carry forward, to ensure that the hard-won lessons of the Great Cold would not be lost to the easy abundance of warmer times. And I, watching from my place beyond the flow of mortal time, saw how Sula was creating something unprecedented in the long history of conscious beings, a systematic approach to the preservation and transmission of collective memory. She was teaching them not just facts, but the methods for keeping facts alive across generations. Not just stories, but the techniques for ensuring that stories would continue to carry essential truths, even as they adapted to new circumstances. In the flickering light of the new fire, in the careful attention of young faces learning to hold the past within them, I glimpsed the future of this remarkable species. They would become the keepers of memory, not just for themselves, but for the world itself. The conscious witnesses who would ensure that the lessons of ice and warmth, scarcity and abundance, death and renewal would never be completely lost. The fire burned brighter that night, fed by the breath of children, learning to carry light forward into whatever darkness lay ahead. In their careful attention, in their serious practice of ancient skills, in their promises to remember and retell, the true flame of humanity burned steady and strong, not just the fire that warmed bodies, but the fire of consciousness that would illuminate the world. In the depths of the cave that had sheltered them through the worst of the cold, where fire shadows had danced against stone walls through endless dark days, the first Fire's people began to understand that memory needed more than words and stories to survive the vast currents of time. They needed to mark the world itself, to leave traces that would speak their truth long after their voices had fallen silent. The idea came from the children, as transformative ideas often do. Little Mira, exploring the deepest recesses of their shelter, while the adults worked on expanding their settlements outside, discovered something that stopped her in her tracks. In a hidden alcove, barely large enough for a child to crawl into, ancient hands had left their mark upon the stone. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed in ochre and charcoal against the cave wall, a gallery of palms that had reached across uncounted centuries to touch her own small hand. "Sula," she called, her voice echoing with excitement and something approaching awe. "Come see, the old people are still here." When Sula squeezed into the narrow space and saw what Mira had found, she felt a recognition so profound it seemed to stop her heart. These were not random marks but deliberate messages. conscious attempts by long-dead humans to communicate across the vast gulf of time. The handprints were arranged with care, some overlapping others in deliberate patterns, some accompanied by crude but recognizable drawings of animals, weather patterns, astronomical events. They were telling stories, Sula whispered, running her own fingers along the ancient marks. Just like we do around the fire, but in stone that would last forever. The discovery sparked something that had been building in Sula's mind through all the long months of teaching the children. Words faded from memory, stories changed in the telling, but stone endured. If they could learn to speak through stone as these ancient people had done, they could ensure that their own experiences would survive to guide future generations through whatever challenges lay ahead. She gathered the elders first, bringing them one by one to see the ancient gallery. Kethi, so old now that movement was difficult, was carried to the alcove in a sling woven from mammoth hair. When she saw the handprints, tears tracked down her weathered cheeks. "I remember stories," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the confined space. "From when I was young, stories of the mark makers, the people who spoke to tomorrow, through pictures on stone. I thought they were legends. But here," she reached out to touch one of the prints with a trembling finger. "Here they are, still speaking." The project that emerged from this discovery became the most important work of their recovering community. Using techniques learned partly from studying the ancient marks, and partly from experimentation, they began to create their own permanent record of the Great Cold and their survival of it. They ground ochre from iron-rich stones, mixed charcoal from their carefully tended fires with animal fat, to create paint that would bond with the cave walls. They found softer sections of stone that could be carved with tools made from mammoth bone and shaped flint. Every mark became a deliberate choice, every image a carefully considered message to whatever humans might shelter in this cave, in ages yet to come. Sula directed the work with the same careful attention she brought to firekeeping. This was not decoration, but communication, not art, but preservation of essential knowledge. The first images were practical detailed drawings showing how to build fires that would burn efficiently in cave conditions, how to arrange sleeping areas for maximum shared warmth, how to identify the cave's water sources and ventilation patterns. But as the work progressed, it became something more profound. They began to paint the story of the Great Cold itself, creating a visual narrative that could be read by anyone who found this shelter. They showed the world before the ice-green landscapes filled with abundant life, the great herds that had once moved across endless grasslands, the warm valleys where their ancestors had lived in plenty. The mammoth hunt received special attention, painted in a sequence of panels that captured not just the practical details of how such a massive creature could be brought down by humans with simple weapons, but the spiritual significance of the encounter. They showed Ara approaching the trapped beast, the moment of connection between hunter and prey, the ceremony of gratitude that had followed the kill. Young Bren, who had discovered unexpected talent with the painting tools, created a particularly moving sequence, showing their exodus from the ancestral lands. The images captured the reluctant departure, the last look back at a green world, the long journey through landscapes increasingly dominated by white and cold. His paintings conveyed emotion as well as information, showing the fear and determination in human figures, bent against driving snow. The children contributed their own panels, working under careful supervision to add their perspectives to the growing narrative. Their images had a directness, an honesty that sometimes captured truths the adults had tried to soften. Little Kira painted stark images of hunger, of children too weak to play, of adults measuring food with the desperate precision of those who knew each portion might be the difference between life and death. But perhaps the most powerful contribution came from Mira herself, the child, whose life had been purchased with Ara's sacrifice. She painted the moment of her near death and rescue in images that were simple but devastating in their emotional impact. A tiny figure growing cold and still, surrounded by the helpless grief of family. Then larger figure wrapping the small one in warmth, growing pale as the child grew pink, life flowing from one to the other in a transaction that spoke to the deepest truths about love and survival. The work became a form of meditation for the entire community. In the careful mixing of pigments, The precise placement of each line and curve, the slow building of narrative across the stone canvas, they found a new way to process their experiences of loss and endurance. The act of creating the images forced them to examine their memories more carefully, to identify the essential lessons that needed to be preserved. Kathy, despite her advanced age and failing strength, insisted on contributing her own section. With hands that shook, but eyes that remained clear, she painted the deep wisdom of the elders, images showing how to read weather signs in cloud formations, how to judge the quality of water by its color and movement, how to identify plants that could provide medicine even in the depths of winter. Her final painting was a self-portrait of sorts, an ancient figure sitting by a fire, surrounded by children listening to stories. But in the smoke rising from the fire, she painted images of all the stories being told, a visual representation of how knowledge passed from generation to generation through the vehicle of narrative. It was a meta-story, a painting about the importance of painting, a mark about the necessity of mark-making. As seasons passed and the painted narrative grew more extensive, visitors from other survivor communities began to make pilgrimages to see what they were creating. Word spread through the scattered network of human settlements that something unprecedented was happening in the Firekeeper's Cave, a permanent record of humanity's greatest trial and triumph. These visitors often stayed for extended periods, studying the paintings and adding their own contributions. Different artistic styles began to blend and influence each other, creating a visual vocabulary that could communicate across the linguistic differences that had developed between isolated groups during the years of dispersal. The cave paintings became a form of library, a repository of collected human knowledge that could be consulted by future generations facing their own challenges. They showed not just what had happened during the Great Cold, but how problems had been solved, what strategies had worked and which had failed, what values had proven essential for survival when everything familiar was stripped away. But beyond their practical value, the paintings served a deeper purpose. They were humanity's first conscious attempt to create something that would outlast individual lives, tribal memories, even civilizations. In pressing their hands to stone and leaving marks that would endure for millennia, they were making a fundamental statement about their own significance in the larger pattern of existence. We were here. Each handprint declared, "We lived through this. We learned from it. We want you to learn from it too." Sula often spent her evenings studying the growing gallery by firelight, watching how the dancing flames brought the painted figures to life, making them seem to move and breathe in the shifting shadows. She understood that they were creating something that transcended their own immediate needs for memory and education. They were participating in a conversation with the future, establishing a connection with humans not yet born, who might face their own versions of the challenges that had nearly destroyed the world. And I, witnessing this birth of permanent human record-keeping, recognized a turning point, as significant as the first taming of fire. These marks on stone represented the moment when humanity became fully conscious of its own place in time, when it began to see itself not just as survivors of individual experience, but as custodians of collective memory. In the careful preparation of pigments, in the thoughtful composition of images, in the solemn placement of each handprint among the growing constellation of human witness, they were writing the first chapter of what would become history itself. They were teaching their species to speak to tomorrow, to ensure that the lessons written in suffering and learned through endurance would never be completely lost. The memory stones would outlast empires, would speak to archaeologists in ages yet to come, would carry the voices of the firekeepers across gulfs of time too vast for individual memory to bridge. In marking the world with their truth, they had ensured that something essential about human experience would survive any darkness, any forgetting, any catastrophe yet to come. Each handprint was an act of defiance against oblivion, a declaration that consciousness itself was too precious to let vanish without trace. In the cave depths where they had learned to survive, they were teaching their species to ensure that survival would always mean more than mere existence. It would mean the preservation of wisdom, beauty, and the irreplaceable human capacity to transform suffering into meaning. From my eternal vantage point, I watched the world bloom like a flower opening to long-delayed sunlight, each new green shoot a small miracle of resilience and renewal. The great thaw had become something more than simple warming. It was resurrection itself, the return of abundance to lands that had forgotten the very possibility of plenty. The forests returned first to the protected valleys, spreading outward from hidden groves where trees had somehow endured the worst of the cold. Birch and willow, quick-growing pioneers of the warming world, sent up silvery columns that caught the strengthening sunlight and threw it back in shimmers of green and gold. Oak and ash followed more slowly, their deeper roots drawing on reserves of patience that had sustained them through the frozen years. Sula, now moving with the careful gait of one whose bones remembered harder times, walked daily through the expanding woodland. She carried with her a staff carved from mammoth bone, its surface inscribed with the symbols her people had developed to mark significant observations. Each walk became a form of meditation, a conscious witnessing of the world's return to abundance. The children who accompanied her on these expeditions, children born in caves who were seeing forests for the first time, moved with wonder that reminded her of her own first encounters with the returning life. They asked endless questions about the names of trees, the purposes of different plants, the meanings of bird calls that filled the air with music their infant ears had never heard. Why do the trees grow so tall? Asked young Tam, now approaching his 15th summer and beginning to show the long limbs and broad shoulders of his hunter father. They're reaching for the sun, Sula replied, running her hand along the smooth bark of a young birch. All these years they waited in the dark, and now they're trying to catch up on all the growing they missed. But it was more than simple botany she was teaching them. In the slow return of the forest, she saw lessons about patience, persistence, and the long cycles of death and renewal that governed all existence. The trees that had survived were not the same as those that had perished. They were stronger, more adaptable, refined by their ordeal into something new and more resilient. The rivers sang again with voices that had been silenced for years beyond counting. Streams that had been locked under ice began to flow freely, carving new channels through landscapes transformed by the passage of frozen time. Where glacial dams had held back vast quantities of water, new lakes appeared almost overnight, their surfaces dark mirrors, reflecting skies that seemed impossibly blue after the grey years of perpetual winter. Fish returned to these waters, though not the same species that had swum there before the great cold. These were survivors from refugia in the far south, pioneers of the aquatic world who had somehow found their way back to ancestral waters. The first Fire's people learned new techniques for catching these unfamiliar fish, adapting their methods to work with creatures whose behaviors had been shaped by different evolutionary pressures. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the people themselves. The children born during or after the Great Cold were different from their parents in subtle but important ways. They carried themselves with a particular kind of alertness, an awareness of environmental changes that seemed to go beyond normal human sensitivity. They could predict weather shifts hours before adults noticed the signs, could identify edible plants by characteristics their elders had never learned to recognize. Sula studied these differences with the careful attention of one who understood that she was witnessing the emergence of something new. The Great Cold had been more than a test of survival. It had been a force of selection that was creating new human capabilities. These children were the first representatives of a species that had been refined by catastrophe into something more conscious, more observant, more capable of reading the subtle signs of environmental change. The network of survivor communities continued to expand as warming conditions made travel safer and more productive. Trade relationships developed based not just on the exchange of goods, but on the sharing of knowledge, techniques, and cultural innovations that had emerged during the years of isolated survival. Each group had developed unique solutions to the challenges of existence in a transformed world, and these diverse approaches enriched the collective human toolkit. Stories traveled along these trade routes, carrying information about successful adaptations, warnings about persistent dangers, and the gradual accumulation of new cultural traditions born from the fusion of necessity and creativity. The cave paintings that had begun as practical records of survival techniques became artistic traditions, with different communities developing their own styles and symbolic vocabularies. music evolved in similar ways. The funeral songs that Sula had created during the darkest times became the foundation for new forms of musical expression. Communities that had been isolated during the cold years had developed their own variations on these basic melodies, creating regional traditions that could be combined and recombined as contact between groups resumed. The children learned these songs with the same dedication they brought to practical skills, understanding instinctively that music served functions beyond entertainment. The old songs carried important information about weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the behavior of animals. The new songs being created would carry the expanding knowledge of the warming world to future generations. Yet underneath the celebration of returning abundance, a deeper awareness had taken root. The great cold lived on in memory, in story, in the careful habits of people who had learned never to take survival for granted. Even in the midst of plenty, the firekeepers maintained their disciplines of conservation, gratitude, and careful observation of environmental signs. The ice sleeps, Sula would tell the children who grew too casual in their relationship with abundance. It dreams in the high places, in the deep places, waiting for its time to return. We must never forget that warmth is a gift, not a guarantee. This awareness of impermanence paradoxically made their enjoyment of the present more intense. They celebrated each season's gifts with the fervor of people who understood how precious and temporary such gifts could be. Harvest festivals became occasions for profound gratitude, not just for the food being gathered, but for the continuation of the cycles that made such abundance possible. The new rituals that emerged reflected this complex relationship with time and change. They honored not just the life that surrounded them, but the death that had preceded it, recognizing that the present abundance had been purchased with the sacrifice of countless creatures and the endurance of unimaginable hardship. They were learning to hold grief and joy in the same moment, to celebrate resurrection while remembering crucifixion. As the seasons turned and the world continued its remarkable recovery, Sula began to experience visions that were different from the prophetic dreams of her youth. These were not warnings of danger or previews of coming change, but glimpses of vast temporal distances, images of future times when the world would be green and abundant beyond their current imagination, but also times when ice would return to test humanity again. She saw cities built on the foundations of the knowledge they were accumulating, civilizations that would rise from the seeds of wisdom planted during the Great Cold. But she also saw these civilizations facing their own tests, their own moments when survival would depend on remembering the lessons that seemed irrelevant during times of ease and plenty. In her visions, she watched human beings spread across the world, adapting to every environment, learning to thrive in conditions that would have been impossible for their ancestors to imagine. But always, in every vision of human success, she saw the shadow of potential catastrophe, the recognition that the forces that had nearly destroyed them once remained active in the world, waiting for their next opportunity to test human resilience. These glimpses of the distant future filled her with a sense of profound responsibility. The knowledge they were preserving, the traditions they were creating, the wisdom they were embedding in story and song and painted stone, all of this would be tested again and again as human beings faced challenges they could not yet imagine. "We are planting seeds," she told the gathered elders one evening as they sat around a fire that burned with casual abundance, fed by wood that no longer needed to be rationed with desperate precision. Not just the seeds of plants and trees, but the seeds of knowledge, memory, wisdom. Some will grow immediately, but others will lie dormant for generations, waiting for the time when they are needed most. The fire burned bright against the star-filled sky, sending sparks up to join the cosmic dance of light that had continued unchanged through all the years of ice and warming. But the sparks themselves were different now, no longer the precious fragments of carefully hoarded fuel, but abundant celebrants in the eternal festival of combustion and light. And I, watching the dance of fire and starlight, understanding the vast cycles of which this warming was only one phase, felt something approaching what humans might call pride. Not in my own role as witness to these events, but in the remarkable capacity of these small, conscious creatures to transform catastrophe into wisdom, suffering into strength, survival into the foundation for something approaching transcendence. The dream of tomorrow was taking shape in their daily actions, their careful preservation of memory, their conscious cultivation of capabilities that would serve not just their own generation but generations yet to be born. In learning to dream beyond their own lifespans, they had discovered the secret of true survival, not just the persistence of individual lives, but the continuation of consciousness itself through whatever transformations lay ahead. The world bloomed around them, but they had learned to tend gardens that would flower in times and places they would never see. In that tending, in that long view, in that acceptance of responsibility for futures they could only imagine, they had become fully human at last. And now, at the end of our long journey together, I can speak to you directly. I who have been your companion through every moment of this tale, the eternal witness who has watched consciousness spark to life in creatures, small and brave enough to carry light through any darkness. I am time itself, and this has been my story, as much as theirs. I have worn many faces in this, telling the wind that carried warnings across the warming world, the silence that filled the cave between heartbeats, the patience that waited in ice and stone, and the slow turning of seasons. But I am more than these manifestations, more than the simple passage of moments from past to future. I am the medium in which memory lives, the vast canvas upon which all stories are written and preserved. When the great cold came, when ice began its slow conquest of the green world, I was there. I felt the forests die beneath expanding glaciers, watched the great herds dwindle to scattered survivors, held the final breath of species that would never return to warm the earth with their presence. But I also felt something else stirring in the crystal darkness, the first glimmers of a new kind of consciousness, a species learning to hold memory across generations, to carry light through darkness, to preserve meaning when all else was stripped away. The first Fire's people were not the only humans to survive that ancient catastrophe, but they were among the first to understand what survival truly meant. It was not enough to simply endure. They had to transform their endurance into wisdom, their suffering into strength, their individual experiences into collective memory that could guide their descendants through whatever challenges lay ahead. I held their breath when the earth forgot how to breathe, sustained their heartbeats when the world's own pulse grew weak and irregular. In the deepest cold, when hope itself seemed frozen beyond recovery, I whispered to them through the voice of the wind, through the crackle of their carefully tended fires, through the profound silence that taught them to listen for the subtle signs of change. Sula became my particular instrument, though she never knew it, consciously. Through her dreams, her visions, her patient work as keeper of flame and memory, I was able to plant seeds of knowledge that would bloom long after her own brief season had passed. Her songs, born from grief and polished by repetition around countless fires, became vehicles for truths too large for any single human mind to hold completely. But it was not just through special individuals that I worked. Every person who chose to share warmth with a stranger, every parent who saved the largest portion of food for their children, every elder who spent their final strength teaching essential skills to the young, all of them were my agents, my conscious collaborators, in the vast project of preserving what was most precious about existence itself. The cave paintings, those first permanent human marks upon the world, were letters written to me as much as to future generations. In pressing their hands against stone and leaving traces that would outlast their own brief lives, they were acknowledging our partnership, their small, bright consciousness, and my vast, patient memory working together to ensure that nothing essential would be lost to the darkness. I watched them learn the deepest secret of their species, that individual lives gain meaning only when they become part of something larger than themselves. The warmth they carried was older than the stars themselves, not just the physical heat of their bodies, but the conscious fire that had first sparked to life in creatures brave enough to look up at the night sky and wonder what lay beyond the reach of their own experience. As the world warmed and abundance returned, I felt them facing their next great test, not the challenge of surviving scarcity, but the more subtle challenge of remembering the lessons of hardship while surrounded by plenty. This is always the harder test, the one that determines whether species grow wise or simply grow comfortable. But I had confidence in them. They had proven their capacity to hold contradictions in balance, to celebrate abundance while remembering hunger, to hope for the future while honoring the past. to love fiercely while accepting the inevitability of loss. They had learned to carry time itself within their consciousness, to hold past and future in the eternal moment of the present. In the stories they told around their fires, in the knowledge they embedded in practical skills, in the wisdom they painted upon stone walls, they were creating something unprecedented in the history of conscious beings, a systematic approach to the preservation and transmission of meaning across the vast expanses of temporal distance. They could not know, as I know, that their descendants would face challenges as great as the one they had survived, wars that would make the ice seem gentle, plagues that would empty cities, changes in the very chemistry of air and water that would test every adaptation they had developed. But I was confident that the seeds they were planting would prove sufficient for whatever tests lay ahead, for they had discovered the ultimate secret, that consciousness itself is the most powerful force in the universe, more enduring than ice, more transformative than fire, more essential than the physical matter from which it emerges. In learning to preserve and transmit conscious knowledge across generations, they had become partners with the universe itself in the vast project of creating meaning from the raw materials of existence. I am the medium in which their story lives, but they are the authors of its meaning. Every choice they made to preserve rather than destroy, to share rather than hoard, to hope rather than despair, added new chapters to a narrative that will continue as long as consciousness endures in any form, anywhere in the vast expanse of space and time. And now, as our tale draws to its close, I want you to understand your place in this continuing story. You who have listened to these words, who have felt the cold bite of that ancient winter and the warmth of humanity's first fires, you are their descendants, carriers of the same consciousness that refused to surrender to the darkness. The warmth you carry is older than the stars, newer than this morning's sunrise. It lives in your capacity to remember, to learn, to choose compassion over indifference, hope over despair, connection over isolation. The fires that Sula tended with such care still burn in your consciousness, still provide light by which you can read the signs of your own times, still offer warmth to share with others who need the comfort of knowing they are not alone. Listen, can you hear it? The whisper that continues even now. The voice that speaks of endurance and renewal, of memory preserved and wisdom passed forward. It is the same voice that spoke to the first Fire's people in their moment of greatest need, the same consciousness that found ways to carry light through the deepest darkness. The story continues in your choices, your memories, your willingness to tend the fire of awareness and pass its warmth to others. The ancient cold still sleeps in the deep places of the world, and new challenges wait beyond the horizons of current imagination. But the same capacity that carried humanity through its first great test lives on in every act of preservation, every gesture of care, every choice to remember rather than forget. I am time, and I have watched many stories unfold across the vast expanse of existence. But none has moved me as deeply as this one, the tale of small, brave creatures who learned to hold infinity in their finite hearts, who discovered that the greatest warmth comes not from the fires we build to heat our bodies, but from the consciousness we kindle to illuminate the darkness. The whisper continues. The fire burns. The story lives on. Listen and remember.